It's a very good morning and welcome to Saturday Live, where we've been squabbling over diver Chris Mears' gold medal. His hair wreathed with the faint smell of chlorine.
David Baddiel, fresh from whipping in rusty buglers for BBC's Get Playing, is here with a new book for children, a new very funny show about bereavement.
Dwarf elephants are Dr Tori Herridge's unlikely muse, scampering round Crete less than 500,000 years ago. Them, not her, but she's here with her asteroid hat on.
And the medic who looked after Roald Dahl in his last illness discusses the great writer's fascination with medicine.
All these plus the story of an economic migrant and the cottage that came back, and inheritance tracks from football legend Rudd Gullit to come. But first...
Welcome to our guest then, to the writer and comedian David Baddiel, to Tom Solomon, who's written a book about his encounter with Roald Dahl, lover of fossils, Tori Herridge, and Chris Mears, Olympic gold medal winning diver. Now, we were looking through the stories of the week and we're rather tickled by poor old NASA, you may have read this in the papers, who accidentally sold off a priceless artefact from Apollo 11 and are now embroiled in all sorts of legal battles to try to get it back. Now, just for information, it was a bag used to collect moon samples in 1969, snapped up by a woman in Illinois for £700, bargain, all because of a clerical error. So we were wondering, because we're very nosy that way, what have you given away by accident and did you get it back? Anyone get any sort of Tom Solomon, what about you? Ever lost anything?
The thing is, I don't give things away because I'm a bit of a hoarder. And so my wife kind of goes mad with me. I hold on to everything. And at one stage, she decided that she would give things away for me, including my lovely yak jacket, as it was known, which I'd had since age 17. And it was so mouldy and disgusting. It had more or less, it's made from a yak in Nepal. It more or less grown legs again and walked off. So she gave that away to the local charity shop and I never saw it again. But I was an Olympic torchbearer when we'd had the Olympics here in the UK. And I ran with my torch through the streets of Liverpool and loved it. And then promptly, in all the excitement, left my torch on the bus. But at the end of the day, they worked out there was one torch left that shouldn't be on the bus, and they got it back to me.
Thank you. I'm glad that they count the torches at the end of the day. Thank you. Now, David Baddiel has said in the past that he has no shame gene, that he will talk and write about almost anything, even the personal stuff. His new show, My Family Not the Sitcom, centres on his parents, a mother who had an affair and a father who has dementia. He's also just written another children's book, Annie Malcolm. Tell us then about the story that you are telling currently in the West End, the one about your mother and your father. I know you've described it as a twisted love letter to your parents. Why is it twisted?
Well, what happened was when my mum died in 2014, I noticed something. I don't know if the Reverend here do funerals. Do you do funerals?
Many funerals.
Yes.
Okay, well, one thing I noticed at my mum's funeral is that a lot of people were coming up to me and telling me that my mother was wonderful. And the thing that bound all these people together was they didn't really know her, hardly at all. It's certainly not what you'd have used to describe her if you did know her. And I thought, well, this is awful. Not only has she gone, and she died very quickly, but she's now being erased by this kind of propaganda that we surround the dead with.
They're trying to make you feel better,
Yes, they're doing
they?
the wrong thing there, because I thought, well, no, all I can see is this erasure of her in this rose-tinted idea of her. So really the show was inspired by that, which is, I think that the way to preserve the memory of those we have loved and lost is to call up their weirdnesses, their madnesses and their flaws, really, because that is what makes them human, because the dead, despite what we might think are not angels.
Have you found it at all difficult during the show? I
Yeah.
mean, because I've talked to a lot of people about a lot of things, but at the moment recently been talking about my book, especially my time with Roald Dahl. And there's a bit at the end of it which I never talk about because it gets me going.
Right.
And, so I have to warn people in advance, as long as we keep away from the last couple of days.
Yeah, no, there's a bit at the end of the show, actually, both my mum and dad, there's two little bits that particularly make me sort of struggle emotionally or struggle physically to get to because my throat closes. But as far as I'm concerned, I will stop doing it if my throat doesn't close, because I want it to be authentic. I want it to move me while I'm doing it.
Do you have any ethical concerns? It's the nature of biography, isn't it, autobiography or memoir, that you do release information about people that they might have a different sense about wishing to keep that sort of private. Do you negotiate that, or do you kind of cross your fingers? And
The show talks about, the last 10 minutes is about, how the rights and wrongs of doing this. I talk mainly about how I feel my mother would have felt, and at one point I say, as for I'm very convinced, because my mother really liked the spotlight and really liked talking about this affair, that she would have liked it, perhaps not every element of the show. As for my dad, it's more complicated, and I say that in the show. It's more complicated. I can't justify everything, and I don't know if it is okay to talk about him like this while he's still alive, but I don't know if I need to have everything okay to do it.
It's interesting, the ethics side of things, because Tom, I was going to ask you about this. I mean, clearly you are disclosing something private that happened between you and Roald Dahl, but where do you draw the line?
Well, I was Roald Dahl's doctor 25 years ago, and just because a patient dies, that doesn't mean the confidentiality ends. I mean, I've got lots of doctor friends around the country and who've written to me and said they've enjoyed the book, and they've also said, I had some fascinating, really interesting, famous patients, but of course, that's all they'll say. And so for 25 years, for 20 years, I said nothing at all. And then it was actually Sophie Dahl that was doing a radio programme and got in touch and said, would I mind talking on that programme? And then with the family's permission, I spoke about that. And then Lissy, Dahl's wife, I think, thought that it was quite nice what I'd said then. And then I did a Great Lives programme with Matthew Paris about a year ago. And so it's sort of built up slowly. And I think that the trust has built up from the family. So I wouldn't be doing any of it without the family's permission.
Yeah.
Dr Tori Herridge of the Natural History Museum was on a while ago to talk paleobiology, but she's back with something greater in her sights than the dwarf elephants that once scampered across the Cyclades and gave her more than enough material for a PhD. She's turning her attention now towards asteroids and what happens when they strike Earth, more specifically Britain, the subject of a programme in her new series, Walking Through Time, for Channel 4. Before we get on to asteroids, Tori, please remind us, what is a paleobiologist?
It's a biologist that uses fossils to answer biological questions. So I'm really interested in evolution, and I want to know why evolution happens, how quickly it happens. And to try and answer those questions, I look at fossils of dwarf elephants that used to live on islands like Sicily, Malta, Cyprus, Crete, the Cyclades, Rhodes, Telos, islands in the Mediterranean.
Oh gosh, this is for you, Tori. Desperate Kate Plant urges me to find out. She wants to know how big a dwarf elephant is or was.
They vary, but the smallest were, and you found those on Sicily and Cyprus, were only a metre tall as adults. So they're baby. Yeah, they're baby. Well, there are skeletons. There are fossil-sized skeletons of baby dwarf elephants from Sicily, and they are puppy-sized.
Really?
Large puppies.
I want one.
Too late.
I don't know. We can genetically recreate it. Sure.
Katie Price is going to want a dwarf baby. That'll be the next big thing. Anyway, the Roald Dahl centenary has reminded us of the extraordinary influence of the most popular children's writer before J.K. Rowling came along. Dahl's life was itself a cracking narrative. Pilot ace, diplomat, intelligence officer, and his interests wide, including medicine, as his own doctor found out while looking after him in his declining years. That doctor was Tom Solomon, now director of the University of Liverpool's Institute of Infection and Global Health and professor of neurology at the Walton Centre National Health Service Foundation Trust, and he's written a book, Roald Dahl's Marvellous Medicine. You're an exalted doctor now, Tom, but then you were just a junior doctor on a night shift, I think, when you first met him.
Yes, I was a junior doctor in Oxford, and I'd heard that the world-famous author had been admitted to the wards, and I was on call that night, and I was busy working away on the ward computer. I was actually writing up some research I'd been doing, and I was aware this large figure had sort of walked down the corridor. It was quite late at night, and then seemed to come back again. And then came back again. And I was busy typing away and not really paying much attention, slower and slower every time, and sort of leaning over. And eventually he stopped and said, "What are you doing?" And I looked up, and there was this enormous man with wrapped in a dressing gown with sticking out ears, twinkly eyes. And it was almost like looking up at the BFG. But of course, it wasn't the BFG. It was the BFG's author.
Big friendly giant.
Roald Dahl himself, yes. And we got chatting. I told him what I was doing about writing up some work on malaria, and he was very interested in this because he'd had malaria himself. And it was clear that it was Roald Dahl. And eventually he said to me, "And have you read any of my books?" And I said, "Well, I've not read any, but I loved the film of The Jungle Book."
Oh, no.
And he stopped. But for readers that maybe aren't familiar with it, The Jungle Book is written by a great British author, but it was Rudyard Kipling, not Roald Dahl. So Dahl looked at me for a few moments trying to work out, was I completely ignorant or was this some great joke? And he realised that actually I'd been teasing him, and it was a great joke, and he roared with laughter, and we became good friends after that.
But it was medicine that really he was particularly interested in. How did that come up?
Well, he was always interested in medicine, and from his earliest days, he always said if he wasn't a writer, he would have liked to have been a doctor. And so we chatted every evening. I was on call every third night, and he didn't sleep very well. So rather than going and resting myself, we would chat about all the medical incidents which had happened in his life, and there were many.
Beginning, well, of course, he lost a sister to, was it measles when she was only...
No, he lost a sister to, when he was age 7, to when she was age 7, and she had appendicitis. She died from that. His own daughter died from measles, encephalitis, when she was age 7. So there's lots of sort of parallels. Roald, actually, his father died as well quite soon after his sister died. And then he himself was nearly killed in World War II when his plane came down in the Libyan desert, and he suffered a head injury. And he always used to say that he thought his creative genius came from this big bash on the head. And it's a bit like David was talking about earlier. People, if you do have brain injuries, you can become disinhibited, and that might be due to dementia. It might be due to a big bash on the head. I've brought with me my brain, because I never go anywhere without my brain.
Wow.
We have
taking
this
a
large
picture.
brain.
It's
I'm
a
going to
very
take a picture of it.
multicoloured
This is a multicoloured brain. Most of ours aren't so colourful, but it helps understand what's going on.
I'll just kind of hold up your brain.
And if-
Thank you. Oh, that's beautiful. I'll tweet this straight away.
Thank you very
Hashtag
much.
BBC Saturday
And
Night.
if will you bang in at Running Mad Prof, which is my tweet, because
I will
I
do.
don't want my 3.5 listeners who aren't Saturday Live followers to miss it. But if you put your hand, I know it's radio, but if you put your hand on your forehead, that what you're feeling there behind your hand is the frontal lobe, and that's the bit that stops you doing things. That's the bit that controls you. And if you get damage there, be it from dementia or from a great bash on the head, as happened to Roald, you become disinhibited. And Roald used to think that this was why he had this creative genius. And we argued about this because I'm not sure that his bash was big enough or strong enough. But anyway, he liked a good story, and he would sometimes take liberties with the actuality if it made a good story, because he was a storyteller.
But also, of course, it was the events of his life, what happened to the people around him. His wife, I know, suffered a serious stroke. And yet that seemed to him, he wanted to kind of respond to that himself. He was extraordinarily ingenious and creative, wasn't he?
He was. This was what was amazing. His inventiveness extended beyond his stories. He was also inventive in terms of dealing with the family problems around. So the first one was actually in 1960, when one of his children had a head injury from a road traffic accident. And the child developed hydrocephalus, which is water on the brain. And back then, the treatments for this were not very good. They put in a valve and a shunt, but it kept blocking. And Roald said to the neurosurgeons, "Well, can't you invent something better? Surely one that doesn't keep blocking." And the neurosurgeon said, "Well, I haven't got time, and I wouldn't know where to begin." And Dahl said, "Well, look, I'm going to do this. Will you help me if I have a go?" And basically, he invented a new treatment for hydrocephalus, a valve, with the neurosurgeon. He got a toy maker to make it. They published in the Lancet. They made thousands of them. They were sold all around the world, and the money raised went to charity.
And how long was that used for?
It was
For
used
many
for years
years?
and years, yeah. Until they've been updated, of course. But of course, when he mentioned this to me, he didn't tell me the full story. He just sort of hinted at it. I told him about I was hoping my paper would go in the Lancet, and he sort of said, "Yes, well, of course, I published in the Lancet many years ago." And kind of left it at that.
All this sort of death and illness and jeopardy with plane crashes is very interesting, I think, with Roald Dahl, because I think what makes him a great writer, apart from the pure imagination, is that he's the children's writer more than any other, I think, that understands that you give children some great fantasy they want, being in a chocolate factory or whatever, meeting a giant, and then you make it dangerous, really properly dangerous. There's a real sense in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory that any of those children may die, or something terrible might happen to them at any time.
And often terrible things did happen in his stories, but he made it sound hilarious. And the interesting thing, it was interesting hearing you talking about your children's writing earlier, because David Dahl wrote children's books initially because he told the stories to his children. But there's a lot of kind of links between the children's books and the adult books. You'll remember his adult short stories, The Tales of the Unexpected, had sort of nasty turns and twists in them. And when he wrote his children's stories, often the earlier versions, he sort of started with something that was a bit nasty. But then he thought, right, now how do we make this funny? And so the books that we all love, the BFG, the Matilda, etc. The BFG is interesting, though, because you mentioned his wife's stroke, Patricia's stroke. She had a stroke in 1965, and afterwards she couldn't talk or walk straight afterwards. And back then there wasn't much in the way of stroke rehabilitation. It was sort of where you just leave someone in a corner and hope for the best. And Roald said to me, I didn't want to do that. I didn't want this enormous pink cabbage of a wife. And so he set about a rehabilitation program, 6 hours a day, with neighbours and friends, everybody helping. And the doctors at the time said that's too much, but he got her going again. He got her talking again. she struggled with her language to begin with. She came out with all these funny words, which anyone at home who's got a relative with a stroke will know that they sometimes get their words wrong.
And that was a gift, actually, to a children's writer, wasn't it?
Well, it was. I mean, he wasn't in 65. He was barely a children's writer. He'd done Charlie and he'd done The Gremlins, but he really was just getting going. But she would say things like obligon, I want an obligon, when she meant a cigarette. Or, you're giving me the sinkers, meaning you're making me depressed.
Brilliant.
And so these were words that were better than the original words. And Dahl wrote them down. And then years later, when he came to write the BFG, he sort of he thought back and he had all this idea that made-up words can be much better than the original words.
He was also an activist, wasn't he? I mean, he wasn't just interested in getting involved with individuals. He did like the Stroke Society, I think.
Well, he did. Well, what happened was they when he came up with this regime and he got Patricia going again, people wrote to him saying, how did you do it? And he produced a sort of newsletter to send out to people that were sent out in the thousands, because Patricia Neal was a world famous Oscar-winning actress, and anyone around the world, people had had strokes. So, and then with someone in the village called Valerie Eaton Griffith, he encouraged her to take the newsletter and make it into a book. And then they set up a programme, and essentially the programme that they set up, Val did a lot of the work, developed into the Stroke Association. So it's affected thousands of people.
What's coming across from what you're saying, and what I know about Dahl, is a man of enormous energy. So, but you looked after him towards the end of his life. So how did that work? How did it manifest when he felt that dwindling?
It was interesting because, yes, he was ill, but he was still great fun on the wards. Even though he was ill, he would at night he'd have a little bottle of whiskey tucked away in his locker, and he would sneak this out, pour himself a glass, get a second glass out, see if I would be tempted, which of course I wasn't. It could have been, it's a kind of career-ending thing. He told limericks. He told some really funny limericks. In fact, I noted one down, and then I realised it's probably a bit early in the day. But what I will do is I'm going to tweet it right now. Because it's great, and this was going on towards the end of his life, and then of course, towards the very end, he was very ill, but what he did do was he was prepared to talk about his death. He was prepared to think about what was happening. I think part of the reason he was talking to me, we talked about so much in his life, his literature, his music, because as people will do towards the end of their life, they look back on everything.
They really want to talk. Anyway, we're going to talk some more later. But Roald Dahl's Marvellous Medicine by Tom Solomon was published this week to coincide with Dahl's 100th birthday.
Yeah,
great height.
Yeah, I mean, I think anyone that does that kind of sport has to be, kind of weird, probably. and just have, maybe that's it.
Sorry.
I was going to say, what did it feel like the first time you got back onto the diving board after having that previous experience of
I remember that
going wrong?
because I had a target with my coach at the time, and she was very, very careful with the whole situation because I wasn't supposed to raise my heart rate above a certain, I don't know what it was something ridiculous. When I compete, one of the problems I used to have was I'd make certain changes in training. Let's say, from on the springboard, you have like 1 to 9 of how much bend you get from the springboard and how much feedback that gives you to get height, generate height, and get somersault, which is really important for what I do. But one of the things I used to do is I'd make a change, like I'd change the board number, say, from normally I'd have it on 9 at home. The board was different in this pool in Germany, so I'd have it on 7.5, 8, or 8.5. And then in competition, I'd forget that I'd made this change, and then it went like completely wrong in the competition.
That's the nerves of the competition, isn't it?
Exactly, and it was a change. Like, I talked to my psychologist about that, and she always used to talk about keeping the monkey inside the cage. Weird analogy, but a part of that was basically getting oxygen to the frontal lobe. So I used to, or I still do, when I feel a bit too nervous, go through a series of 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out of breathing 5 times just before I go up onto the board. I now do that every single competition, and what that supposedly does is get oxygen to the frontal lobe so that I can make off-the-cuff decisions straight off the bat rather than just going along with it and then not being able to adjust.
Tom is making notes. This is going to go in his next book.
I always make notes about everything. It's the only way I focused. I mean, I've still got my notes from when I talked to Roald Dahl all those years ago.